This is the third video in a series of 3 videos on homeschool. Previously, we discussed why to homeschool and what homeschool might look like and various options. In this video, we'll consider some specific guidance on implementing the program that we like, a classical discussion-based curriculum. Meet every day. The best way for the student to build up momentum learning a subject is with discussions every day. It's better to do little discussions every day than to have longer discussions separated by more time. To get started, the teacher and the student can either follow a book together or a list of topics that the teacher would like the student to learn. The initial meetings don't have to be long. Young students can start out at 15 minutes a day. You can increase that time according to what works for the teacher and for the student. The key is meeting every day. That's how you build momentum. You want to make it as easy as possible to meet for discussions without distractions. Keep it simple. You really don't need a lot of gear. In fact, probably the less you have, the better. If you're reading from a book, you need 1 or 2 copies of the book. If you're working directly from your own program, then all you probably need is a notebook and a pen to serve as a chalkboard, a place where you can write down or draw ideas that might be helpful to the discussion. The notebook is especially useful for math, where much of your discussion will be working through problems. The cornerstone to the discussion-based approach is establishing a dialogue with your student by way of questions. You can almost always find a way to approach a discussion with questions, and the more you do this, the easier it'll get. This approach is very effective because it engages the student directly in the topic. The student is now thinking about the ideas you are discussing and making the effort to express these ideas. If you pursue this approach from early on, you'll probably often find the student taking the lead in the discussions or with questions. In this, you can see that the student is taking the initiative in the work of learning. Learn the language of the student. One of the first things you have to do as a teacher is to figure out the language of the student. This is establishing the discussion, the communication. That is, where can you connect the ideas that you want the student to understand with what the student already understands? This means having a good sense of what the student understands in the space of your discussion, and also what is the language most effective to communicate with the student in that space. This can be an interesting work for the teacher. It can also be an enlightening work, and it requires a flexibility in thinking about the topics you're teaching. Once you have established a discussion, maintaining the discussion is a constant work of the teacher. You should be alert to potential pitfalls where the discussion can break down. There are broadly 3 categories of pitfalls. First, where the language of the teacher is not well suited to the student. Second, where the ideas you are explaining have not been adequately prepared for the student. And third, where there is a lack of motivation in the student. If the discussion breaks down, it's helpful to recognize the cause, because then you'll know how to change your approach and get back on track. Often, especially in starting out, the cause of a slowdown in the discussion will be that the teacher's language is not well suited to the student. This is a very easy trap to fall into, and in essence, it corresponds to a separation between the language of the teacher and the language of the student. The necessary adjustment here will be for the teacher rather, to find a way to bring the discussion back into the language of the student, the language that the student understands, in terms of vocabulary and in terms of images, for example. Sometimes the way forward might be to identify here language for the student to learn, to be able to bridge the gap. Often, it will be helpful for the teacher to question assumptions underlying explanations and to break down the elements of an explanation into simpler pieces. Sometimes the discussion might slow down not just because of a faulty language connection, but also because there is too big of a gap separating the ideas you are seeking to join into the discussion. To work through this kind of situation, question the assumptions underlying what you are explaining, break down the ideas into simpler pieces, and also be sure there is a clear connection between the ideas that can guide the student. It's also possible, especially early on, that the cause of the slowdown in the discussion is not on the order of language or ideas, but rather is due to a lack of motivation in the student. Here you must find a way to bring the student to a mindset where the student wants to engage in the discussion. You will have to be creative in motivating your students and in being clear on the benefits of making an effort to learn what you are teaching. Try to enjoy the process of figuring out how to connect and develop the ideas that you want your student to understand. But there's no question this is a work of great patience. There will be frustrating moments. Try to keep the long view always and take breaks whenever that can be helpful to the student or to the teacher. Also, keep in mind it's worthwhile building foundations very carefully. Often learning does not proceed at a constant rate, but rather you'll see that it might take a certain time for a student to establish a base of understanding in a topic, and then the progress in understanding accelerates dramatically. This means you should be very patient, especially in the beginning, to establish solid foundations. Don't feel rushed. In addition to the daily discussions, it's a good idea to have the students spend time alone working through the ideas or the kinds of questions developed in the daily discussions. Invite the student to try to think of questions to clear up anything not well understood. In math, I suggest giving the student specifications for making up problems and answering those problems based on the topics that you're discussing, rather than a set piece list of questions and calculations. This kind of assignment lets the student develop the habit of creating questions to answer and not just working through a list of questions proposed by someone else. The teacher can tailor the specifications of the assignments based on what would be most beneficial to the student. Hopefully, you have created a curriculum that sounds fun to you. That's one of the benefits of homeschool. You get to decide. One of the best ways to motivate a student is for the teacher to be interested in the discussion. If you find yourself getting bored, then you probably need to reconsider what you are teaching or how you are teaching. It should always be possible to find an engaging way to teach. This does not mean infantilizing the subject, by the way. To the contrary, often that will lead to boredom, especially for the teacher. But children are naturally curious and they want to learn about the world and they appreciate real discussions.